Mr. Mohideen Khada, Mr. Aloy Joywardner, the heads of the IDB, NEDA, and the EDB, the keynote speaker, Mr. Rajapaksa. Let me first thank you very much for inviting me. Clearly, this is the 54th anniversary of this, the Sri Lanka Chamber for Small and Medium Industry. I understand the very first gathering was held under the patronage of the renowned journalist, Mr. D.B. Dhanapala. So clearly those are very eminent footsteps to follow. So thank you very much for inviting me, and it's a great pleasure to be here. Mr. Mohideen Khada, in his remarks, gave some statistics which demonstrate very clearly the importance of the SME sector in the economy. So I'm not going to run through some of those statistics again because all of you probably know them very well. Suffice to say that if we are serious about having regionally balanced growth and employment generation, if we are serious about having inclusive growth and employment generation, clearly the SME sector has a vital role to play. And so what I'm going to try to talk to you about today, given my current position in the central bank, is to try to answer the question, what can the central bank do to support the SME sector? Of course, we have a number of credit schemes that are directed to the SME sector, Saubhagya and recently Shavasakti. And there are a number of credit schemes directed to the agricultural as well as the livestock and dairy sector. And we administer these through the what we call the participating financial institutions, the banks. But I think more importantly, we have a greater responsibility. Professor Jayasinghe alluded to this. We have a greater responsibility to deliver low and stable interest rates, a competitive and stable exchange rate. Because without that, clearly the challenges of the lions of the SME sector would be even greater than they are. So what are we doing? What are we trying to do to provide stable and lower interest rates and a competitive and stable exchange rate? Only part of that agenda belongs to the central bank, and our remit is really directed at the interest and exchange rates, but the fiscal side is a responsibility of the government. So what is happening now to try to deliver these objectives that I've spoken to you about, the two objectives, is that there are clear frameworks being established for policy making in these areas. And I will try to elaborate a little bit about that. And not only are these frameworks being introduced, but we are trying to institutionalize them. So that they are insulated from short-term political pressures, which can throw policy off track. So what are we trying to do in this respect? So one, the first framework relates to the government's budget. Historically, this has been the main source of instability in the system. Large budget deficits pump excess demand into the economy. That means that inflation goes up, and also some of that excess demand leaks into imports, and we have a balance of payment pressure. High inflation means we have to have high interest rates. When the balance of payments comes under pressure, the exchange rate comes under pressure. So the first thing we need to do is to ensure that we have stable budgetary outcomes. Because that has been the main source of instability in this economy ever since it was liberalized in 1977. Large budget deficits, inflation goes up, balance of payments, and it's a repeating cycle. So when the situation gets really bad, the governments embark on fiscal consolidation. But as soon as there's an election on the horizon, everything goes out the window, and we have this repeating cycle of indiscipline in the financial sector, and we keep doing this again and again. So unless we get out, we were second to Japan at the time of independence on almost any social indicator. Second to Japan in Asia, I should say. But we've slipped a long way down. And in my view, one of the main reasons is this: we haven't been able to have strong economic fundamentals, macroeconomic fundamentals, which would enable our SME sector, which would enable our agriculture, our larger corporates to operate in a predictable and consistent policy framework. This has been one of the main drawbacks that we've had. So we've got to create frameworks which give us stability, which give us predictability, which give us consistency. Okay, so what are these frameworks? One is the government has embarked upon a revenue enhancement-based fiscal consolidation trajectory. The VAT reforms, which were painful, the new Inland Revenue Act, these are all intended to boost government revenue, because government revenue, when I was working in the central bank, I was seconded to work in the finance ministry in the 1980s. Government revenue at those days was 22% of GDP. By 2014, 2015, it had fallen to about 11.7%, almost half of 11.7% of GDP. It's now come back up to about 15. So we need to get revenue up to about 16.5%. Expenditure is about 20% of GDP, which, if you look at our comparator countries, is okay. But there we need to improve the quality of expenditure. So if we have 20% of GDP expenditure, 16.5% of revenue, of GDP revenue, then you have a budget deficit of about 3.5%, which we can finance reasonably easily. We raise about 2 to 2.5% of GDP domestically. And then we would only need to raise about 1% of GDP from outside through foreign borrowing, which is what makes us most vulnerable. When you have a budget deficit of 5%, then you are having to raise 2.5–3% of GDP through foreign borrowing, which exposes us to a lot of risk. So fiscal consolidation is crucial, and it will take us out of this stop-go repeating cycles. On the central bank side, for monetary policy, we are introducing what is called a flexible inflation targeting regime. I'm not going to go into the technical details. If you're interested, the central bank released a roadmap on the 3rd of January, and it's on the roadmap, and we have given in great detail the roadmap we have set out to introduce flexible inflation targeting regime. What it tries to do is to have very much a data-driven, forward-looking, proactive monetary policy. In the past, monetary policy was subservient to fiscal policy. When the government ran very big deficits, the central bank printed money and gave it to them by taking on treasury bills. We want to set up a framework where that cannot happen, where the government can't just load its paper onto the central bank because it's highly inflationary. So in terms of fiscal discipline, this is something as part of the flexible inflation targeting regime. We want to put in a legal and accountability framework which gives the central bank a target for inflation. Currently it's 4 to 6%, and that they have to meet that. But in order to meet that, the accountability is that they have to meet that. If they don't, in some countries, if the inflation target is not met, the central bank governor has to resign. So that's probably a good discipline to have. And then also we need to make sure that there's independence of the central bank. The independence which doesn't force the central bank to be subject to fiscal dominance, where it has to take on this paper that the government sells to it and causes inflation. Inflation is actually very invidious because it is an extremely regressive tax on the poor and vulnerable, because rich people have assets which has a hedge against inflation. Their assets go up in value with inflation, so they're able to hedge. Poor people have no such hedge, and it's vulnerable. So it is critical that we keep inflation low and stable. And this monetary policy framework we are putting in will give us a better chance to do that. On the exchange rate, we are trying to create a framework to give us predictable, competitive, and stable exchange rates. Often it's not recognized that when we have an overvalued exchange rate, we are subsidizing foreign producers over our own. Our exporters are being penalized. Our producers of import competing goods are being penalized, because we are essentially, by having an overvalued exchange rate, subsidizing foreigners trying to sell into our market. So clearly it's important that we have a competitive exchange rate which gives the producers of exports as well as import competing goods a better chance. Now, in order to do that, again, we are trying to build a framework, certain parameters within which we will manage the exchange rate. One thing we have done in the past is try to keep the exchange rate or defend the exchange rate by using our very scarce foreign reserves. For instance, in 2012, between August 2011 and February 2012, we spent $2 billion of our reserves to defend the exchange rate, and in the end depreciated by 15%. Then again in 2015, we spent $1 billion to defend the exchange rate and depreciated by 10%. So all governments, this is not one side or the other, all governments have been guilty of this folly of trying to defend the indefensible, trying to defend the exchange rate, using very scarce foreign reserves, often borrowed foreign reserves, and then having to depreciate anyway. So this is what we want to get away from, to have a more market-oriented exchange rate, and to manage it within certain clear parameters. We are still in the process of putting that together. When it's ready, we will certainly announce it, so business people know the way in which we are going to set the exchange rate. So, and again, there will be certain rules for the operation of the forex market. So we are trying to set clear frameworks, and we are trying to institutionalize them. I should have also said, in terms of the budget deficit, what we are arguing in the central bank, and I hope the government will accept it, is, we have a Fiscal Responsibility Management Act, which sets some targets for the budget deficit and the public debt as a percent of GDP. It was introduced, I think, in 2003, but in almost every year we have breached it. So it doesn't have any teeth. What we are trying to convince the government, and I hope all of you will help us to do that, is to have only very specific reasons for breaching those targets. i.e., for instance, if you have a natural disaster and the government has to spend a lot of money, or there is a severe recession because the prices of our exports have collapsed, or whatever, and again the government has to take counter-cyclical measures to boost the economy. So there will be specified reasons when the targets can be breached. And even when those targets are breached, the government should set out a clear path as to how they will come back on track. So these are the fiscal rules we are trying to convince the government they should adopt. Because you see, we can't go on as we have done in the past. One, we are no longer a low-income country, so we don't get very generous foreign aid. We used to get money at next to, like never money, 40, 50-year maturity, less than 1% interest. We are no longer eligible for that money. We have to go to markets and borrow at 5, 6, 7%. So it's a different paradigm we're in. So we can't do the things like we did in the past, where we have this fiscal profligacy and then try to hold brakes, and it just doesn't work. We can't afford the kind of policy making that we've had in the past. We are now exposed to international capital markets. We are exposed to rating agencies, and given our debt dynamics, if we can't have access to go and borrow in the foreign markets, we'll be in serious difficulty in terms of meeting our expenditure commitments. Now, let me say a little bit about the fourth framework, which is about how to manage the foreign debt. Clearly, our debt to GDP is 79%, and our rating peers, countries with our same rating, the medium is around 50%. We are at almost 80%. Our interest payments amount to 38% of our total revenue. The median for our comparator countries is 9%. So that is the debt situation we're in. It is clearly very, very serious. But my colleagues in the central bank have come up with strategies to manage it. We are confident that we can manage it. Provided the government sticks to its fiscal consolidation program, we believe that we have got some strategies to manage it. The domestic debt peaks this year, and we've got a bit of a buffer stock, which we raised last year, which will help us, hopefully, to manage that. The external debt, from 2019 onwards, there's going to be bunching, large payments. So the government is going to enact a Liability Management Act, which will give us more flexibility. You see, now, the borrowing by the government in any given year is limited to its borrowing requirement in that year. So we can't borrow a bit extra to create a buffer to manage the liabilities which are up there, coming up on the horizon. So the Liability Management Act will give us a little bit more headroom. There'll be still a limit, and the reasons why we can exceed the annual borrowing limit will be given very specifically why you can do it. And then we can raise some extra money, hopefully this year, to try to manage the debt that's coming up from 2019 onwards by extending the tenor, by switching more expensive liabilities for less. So my colleagues have put together this strategy, which we hope to be able to use to manage the situation. But in the end, this is all kind of buying time. We are trying to extend the tenor, we are trying to bring down costs, etc. In the end, to get out of the debt, we have to export, particularly the foreign debt. The domestic debt you can even repay if push comes to shove by printing money. But foreign debt, if you don't repay and you don't have access to that market to raise money, you get into a situation like Greece. That's what happened to Greece. The market stopped lending to them, and there was massive compression of consumption in the economy. The people had a terrible time. So that is what, if we don't get it right, that's where we will end up. But we are confident we can manage it, provided the government sticks to its fiscal targets. So these are the kind of frameworks that are being put in place to try to give SMEs low and stable interest rates and a competitive exchange rate, which gives them a better chance in terms of competing with foreign producers. Now, let me also say what else is being done. In addition to these frameworks which hopefully will improve the macroeconomic fundamentals, clearly the government has to improve the investment climate. And there are some measures in place where they're trying to do that. They have an action plan to improve Sri Lanka's ranking in the Doing Business Index. Things like construction permits, getting a company registered, paying taxes. So there are these, under each of these pillars of the Doing Business Index, there's an action plan which the government is implementing. It could go a lot faster, but it is moving, hopefully, in the right direction. And that should improve the investment climate, the doing business climate for all of you, in terms of if you want to register a company, if you want to get a construction permit, if you want to if payment of taxes is made easier, etc. Clearly that will reduce your transaction costs. There are also trade facilitation measures, a single electronic window in the customs, a trade portal, the the CEO of the EDB is here. They're working on an export strategy. So the trade facilitation agenda is being driven by a national trade facilitation committee, which was set up after Sri Lanka signed the trade facilitation agreement at the WTO. And of course, these trade agreements. Now, clearly we have to negotiate them carefully to make sure that our interests are pursued effectively. But one thing, if we are able to negotiate successful trade agreements with China and also deepen the agreement with India, we would be the only country in the world with preferential access to China, India, and to Europe through GSP+. There is no other country in the world which could say that, provided we are able to successfully negotiate the trade agreement. Again, I must emphasize, we have to negotiate carefully, we have to make sure that our interests are pursued effectively, and we have to have measures, trade adjustment measures to support companies which are adversely affected. The government is trying to put something together. We have to get the anti-dumping law passed. It's in Parliament, but it must be passed. So you have to do all these things. It's a package. So we have to give the anti-dumping protection, trade adjustment, and the markets for our exporters. And the other thing is to show foreign investors this preferential access to this market of 3 billion people, India, China, and Europe. You can locate in Sri Lanka and sell on a preferential basis to all these markets. So that opens up a lot of possibilities. So finally, let me just say a little bit about, I know very little about it. I've been a bureaucrat all my life, so I know very little about business. But just some personal thoughts on the SME sector and its development and as to how one should approach it. We've got the IDB, NEDA, EDB, all of them doing excellent work. But it's my own take on this is that we really need a very holistic approach. And there are 4 levels at which I feel we need to intervene effectively. One is clearly training, whether it's entrepreneurial skills, it's financial skills, or even technical skills. Clearly, training is a crucial factor. The second thing is inputs, access to technology and other inputs. The third thing is what Professor Jayasinghe spoke about, which is access to finance. And there, as I said, if we can manage our macroeconomic policy well and keep interest rates down, then the access to finance problem becomes more manageable. But for me, the biggest challenge and the area where we have done least is marketing. In my view, you need to move backwards. If you find a market, then the credit comes. It's not difficult. If you go to a bank and you have a guaranteed market to sell into, they will give you the money. So that is where we have not worked hard enough to see how we can link our SMEs, my micro enterprises, into supply chains in their own locality, the SMEs into national supply chains, into regional supply chains, into global supply chains. That is something we have not worked hard enough at, in my view. Our whole kind of cold chain has not been developed. We don't have storage capacity. There are so many things that need to be done to ensure that the capacity for SMEs to link into supply chains, and as I said, at the locality level, at the regional level, at the global level, needs to be improved. And this, I think, we need this kind of holistic approach, and with a big focus on helping SMEs with markets and access to markets and hooking them up into supply chains. So those are some thoughts that I'd like to share with you. As I said, this is a critical sector of the economy. not just in terms as a determinant of growth and of employment generation, but as I said, also in terms of regionally balanced growth, of inclusive growth. Clearly that's crucial. So the SME sector has an important role to play at several levels. And I hope, from the central bank's point of view, we can manage things well enough to deliver those relatively low interest rates and a stable and competitive exchange rate, which is what we're trying to do. Thank you very much.